Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Gloucester Marine Genomics Institute Science Hour. I'm Andrea Bodner, the Donald G. Combs Science Director at GMGI, and tonight I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Stephen Austad, who's going to share some of his fascinating work studying some of the world's longest living animals. But before the presentation begins, I'd like to share with you a brand new video that GMGI's communications team has put together that highlights some of the work that we're doing here at GMGI, where our mission is to address critical challenges facing our oceans, human health, and the environment through innovative scientific research and education. This 1-minute video showcases both our research and our education initiatives, including our flagship education program, the Gloucester Biotechnology Academy. Just let me share my screen.
The Gloucester Marine Genomics Institute was founded in the belief that the field of genomics, particularly when applied to marine life, represents a new source of opportunity to expand medical and scientific knowledge.
We're changing the trajectory of the community, both through bringing science to the community, making new discoveries that will have an impact on fisheries, on human health, and also changing the trajectory of the students we train at the Academy.
Coming out of the Academy, I have more hands-on experience than a lot of my colleagues that did 4 years in college. It's a small commitment that unlocks life-changing opportunities.
What's really exciting about GMGI is the way the technology has progressed. We're on the cutting edge, and that will allow us to answer these really complex and interesting questions.
We can find new discoveries that can directly impact human health.
We are small but mighty. You would never know that we are a team of under 30 people when you see the groundbreaking research being conducted in our labs and the transformative education experiences being provided at our academy. And we are just getting started.
So as part of our efforts to bring science to the community, GMGI started the Science Hour lecture series in 2020. And tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Stephen Austad. Steve is a distinguished professor and the Protected Life Endowed Chair in Healthy Aging Research in the Department of Biology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He's also the scientific director of the American Federation for Aging Research and founding director of the NIH-supported Nathan Schock Center of Excellence in the Basic Biology of Aging. Steve's research seeks to understand the underlying causes of aging with a long-term goal of developing treatments to slow the aging process, keeping people fit and healthier for longer. He has had a fascinating career that started out as a lion trainer for the Hollywood movie industry, and now his work takes him across the globe studying some of the most fascinating animals on our planet. Steve is also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Gerontological Society of America. He has received multiple prestigious awards for his research, and he has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific publications. Steve has also written 4 books, and I can highly recommend his latest book, which shares the same title as tonight's talk, Methuselah Zoo: What Nature Can Teach Us About Living Longer, Healthier Lives. Steve, we are thrilled to have you with us tonight, and we're really looking forward to hearing about your fascinating work. And for everyone in the audience throughout the presentation, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll have time to get to the questions after Steve's talk. Thanks very much, Steve. Please take it away.
Okay, I will. Let's see if we can you see my slides? Assuming that you can, let me just go ahead and start with a somewhat anomalous slide. Let's see if this is not, there we go. So this is what's called the South Pole on Mount Everest. It's 26,000 feet high. It's one of the coldest and windiest places on Earth. And I'd like you to imagine the morning of May 29th, 1953, when this man, George Low, stood on this spot waiting. And he was waiting for 2 men who had set off at 3:30 in the morning to try to reach the summit of Mount Everest. Now, to understand what I'm going to talk about in a second, you have to understand something about what it took George Low to get to that place. He had trained in the mountains of Wales all winter. He had then taken a ship to India and then to Nepal. He had taken weeks to walk from Nepal to Mount Everest with only the help of 350 porters to help him carry his stuff. And then it took several months of acclimating as he climbed higher and higher and higher in the mountains. But here he stood waiting for these men to appear or not. They would have been the first, but they could have simply disappeared. And he was writing in his journal, and he was writing what he was seeing. And one thing he saw, well, first of all, I forgot to mention, yes, he also needed oxygen, because at this level, you can't stay forever without oxygen, and to keep your mind clear and thinking, you need some oxygen. So as he looked above him, this is what he saw. He saw a flock of geese flying over his head. And he didn't know it at the time, but we now know that those geese, less than 24 hours previously, were at their wintering grounds at sea level. They had flown up to 30,000 feet, flown over the Himalayas in less than 40 hours to their breeding site. They had no supplemental oxygen. They had no special clothes. They had no special training. They just did it. This is the bird, by the way, the bar-headed goose. Now, I think it's very easy for those of us who see birds all the time to forget about what incredible physical feats that they perform routinely. Let me give you one more example. The bar-tailed godwit just was reported to have set a new world's record for a non-stop migration. It flew 8,500 miles from Alaska to Tasmania. Took 11 days and it never stopped. It never landed, it never ate, it never drank. It just beat its wings 4 to 5 times a second for 11 days. Now, these are the sort of Olympic athletes of the avian world, but every bird does stuff that's remarkable. This, for instance, this swallow does what many birds do. It can cruise along at 25 miles an hour and suddenly can dip and land with perfect poise on a thin limb like this, not lose its balance. So all these remarkable feats that I'm describing, I think, are probably less remarkable than what birds do with aging and longevity. And to make that point, let me start off here with an ornithologist George Dunnett. And the bird he's holding is a bird called a northern fulmar. You have these right off of where you are in New England. And George at the time was 23 years old, a fit man. He just started a lifelong project on some of the Outer Hebrides Islands where there's a large colony of these birds. And 42 years later, there's George again. And that's the same bird. George, you might see, looks a little bit different. He's probably no longer bounding over those rocks on the island. The bird has been there the whole time, and the bird actually is still reproducing. Now, for these birds to reproduce, they not only have to lay an egg, they have to fly thousands of miles getting food to feed the chick. Now, I don't know if George is still reproducing. I suspect probably not, but that bird continued to reproduce. George died a few years after this was taken. I waited a decent amount of time, and I called the person who had taken over his study, and I said, Paul, do you mind if I ask you a question? Is that bird still there? And he goes, yeah, actually, it's still there. The bird lasted a few years longer than George did. Now, all of this really has something to tell us that's fairly dramatic about what's happening on the globe right now. In the United States, for instance, there are 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day, and they have been since 2011. What that means is that by 2050, the population just in the US that's 85 or older will triple, and the number of people that are 100 or over will increase by more than 7-fold. This is unprecedented in the 300,000 year history of our species. And so the aging process is going to become more and more and more important. And I want to convince you in kind of a vivid way exactly how important the aging process is. So here are some risk factors for heart disease. These are things that increase your chances of dying from heart disease. And a certain level of hypertension, if you smoke, if you don't control your cholesterol, if you have diabetes, these things all increase your risk of dying of heart disease by a substantial amount. If you put those risk factors next to aging, this is what happens to them. They almost disappear. They're still there, but they're very, very tiny. The same thing, I could do this for virtually any disease of later life. I'll do it for one more. Let's look at Alzheimer's disease. The risk factors there are, one of them is a genetic risk factor. One of them is sex. That doesn't mean that having sex increases your risk of having Alzheimer's disease, so don't worry. What it means, though, is that if you're female, you have an increased risk of having Alzheimer's disease, which is very, very unusual. It's the only disease among the top 15 killers of people that women are more prone to than men. And then there's the ApoE. This is a genetic. If you have a form of the ApoE gene, that makes you that increases your chances of getting Alzheimer's disease by about 500%. Again, if we put all of this in respect to aging, that's what happens. The only one that really is even visible anymore is the ApoE gene. So what this means is that in the 21st century, there's a real imperative for us to learn more and be able to intervene on the aging process, to treat aging as if it were a disease. Because if we don't, what we're looking at is all of these things on the right side of this, more physical ailments, dementia, depression, and on top of that, just massive societal costs. So there really is a motivation to learn as much about aging as we can and to try to figure out how we could slow the process in ourselves. Because if we could do that, rather than addressing one disease at a time, if we could really target the aging process, then we could push back all or most of the maladies of aging all at the same time, which would be a magnificent boon for our species. So how do you go about doing that? For many biomedical problems, you start off looking at the basic biology using laboratory models. You use the fruit fly, which lives about 3 months. You use this tiny worm that's smaller than a grain of rice and lives about 3 weeks. Or the real mammalian workhorse of biomedical research is the mouse, which lives about 3 years. Now, to understand what I'm going to say about these common, very, very useful laboratory animals, you have to understand something about what causes aging. And what causes aging, and I'm going to give you the 30,000-foot view of what causes aging. So this is what causes aging. Now, fire, of course, is destructive. We all know that. You need a fuel like wood, and you combine it with oxygen, and you break apart all the chemical bonds and releases energy and has these waste products of carbon dioxide and water. Now, that fundamental chemistry is exactly the same chemistry that runs life. And like this chemistry, there are byproducts. In fire, it's sparks, it's soot, it's smoke. Well, if we think about what keeps us alive, the fundamental process is metabolism. And like I say, it's exactly the same chemistry. And here the food is the fuel, but it's highly controlled and highly regulated, so it doesn't have a burst of energy like with fire. But like with fire, there are also byproducts that we might not like, the equivalent of soot and sparks and smoke. And a couple of those that I'll mention, and there are many, many more things that go on, but I'll just mention two because I think they're intuitively satisfying. One of them is rust. Rust is just oxidized metal, and this process of metabolism oxidizes the molecules in our body. And just like rust damages the integrity of metals, those oxygen radicals, which are the oxidizing agent, are actually damaging the molecules that make up our body. The other byproduct that's very evident is something called browning. Now, this is the same chemical reaction that goes on when you cook food and you brown your meat. All that is the attachment of sugar molecules to the proteins in the food. And what that would do if those proteins had to do anything except taste good is it would make those proteins look less well. So in our bodies, the same thing happens. But to us, it happens at a very slow rate because we're not being cooked. We're at a colder rate. But over time, we're gradually damaging all the proteins that run all the chemical reactions that form all of the physical structures of our bodies. Now, one of the things that these oxygen radicals attack is DNA. And I want to give you a kind of vivid sense of the level of attack that you're under as you're sitting right there. So think about this. Your body contains, roughly speaking, 40 trillion cells. Now that's 5,000 times the number of cells that there are humans on the planet Earth at this point. So that's a lot of cells. And within each one of those cells, there's DNA. And that DNA is coiled and recoiled and supercoiled so that it can fit into a tiny, tiny cell. A friend of mine once described this as being able to stuff 50 miles of fishing line into a blueberry. But if you uncoiled it and you straightened it out, the DNA in each one of your cells would be about a yard long, a meter long. So if you took all the 40 trillion cells and figure there's a meter's worth of DNA inside each one, it means that your body actually has 2 billion miles of DNA, enough DNA that if you stretched it out and you put it end to end would go beyond the outer reaches of our solar system. So that's amazing enough. But I'm going to give you something I think is a little bit more amazing. So watch this very carefully. So you just made 2,000 miles of new DNA. And that's because you're losing cells all the time. They're being shed off your skin. They're being shed from the lining of all the tubes in your body, which there are hundreds of thousands of miles of. And DNA has to be synthesized newly to make all those new cells. So that's the incredible amount of work. So if you're starting to get, your eyes are starting to droop now listening to me, you'll know why. You just did a lot of work. But the fact is that 2,000 miles of new DNA has already been damaged 30 million times by oxygen radicals. So you're under this incredible attack from the fundamental processes of being alive. So why don't we all dead before we even are weaned? And the answer is that we have incredible repair mechanisms that repair almost all of this. And there's this, life is this balancing act. We're constantly being damaged, but we're constantly repairing that damage or replacing the damaged part. Now, if the balance favors damage and there's relatively little repair or replacement, then things age quickly and they fall apart in a hurry and they die quickly. On the other hand, if there's more of a balance, if repair is almost balancing out the damage, then we might age more slowly. And it's understanding the repair process. And there's over 100 genes whose job is simply to work on repairing our DNA. So we're very, very good at repairing our DNA because even though you just had all those millions of bits of damage to your DNA, we live for decades. So the point of all this is to tell you this, that all laboratory species that are typically used to study aging are relatively failures. They're failures because they're not successful at combating the fundamental destructive processes of aging. And I'm just showing you this by the relative longevity of all the animals that I've talked about relative to humans. So what we're doing, if you think about it, is that we're seeing if we can take complete failures at aging, and if we can make them fail just a little bit less spectacularly, we're hoping that we might elucidate something that if applied to humans might make us, and we already age quite successfully, age a little bit more successfully. And I think maybe that's true, but I think maybe it's not as well, which brings in this issue. Evolution is smarter than you are. One of my favorite quotes by the biochemist Leslie Orgel. And what he meant by that, of course, is not that evolution is smarter than you are individually, but smarter than we are as a species. And the reason is it's had billions of years and billions of experiments on billions of species to figure out how to solve biological problems like repairing DNA or replacing damaged, rusted parts. And the pharmaceutical companies known this for a long time. They used to send people out prospecting in the world for natural products that nature had created to solve specific problems. And one of those products came from this flower, the rosy periwinkle. A chemical that came from it, vincristin, is an anti-cancer drug that's been in use since the 1960s. And it's had a few tweaks chemically to keep it working. But now, why would plants produce something that stops cells from dividing, which is what cancer chemotherapy does? Well, plants are eaten by insect larvae. And if you can stop those cells from dividing, those larvae will never become adults, will never reproduce, and will never come to eat you again in the next generation. So for aging, there's an alternative. And the alternative is to use the hard-won successes of evolution to study, to understand species that are not failures, that live a long time. Here's one example, lake sturgeon that we know lives up to 152 years. There are these giant tortoises that live up to 180 years or so. And there's a Greenland shark that may live, and I say may here emphatically, almost 400 years. Now, would one of these possibly be a species that we might learn something that would tell us something about how to slow our own aging? Well, maybe, but I think it's unlikely, because what these three species have in common, they live a long time, and they do it because they live very, very slowly. Humans want to age slowly. They don't want to live slowly. They want to live like Jean Calment on the right here, a century or more in exquisite health, but in active health, and not be like this frog on the right that's living, but it's frozen solid and it's not going to do anything until the spring thaw. So what I'd like to do now is present a few species and approaches that I think could be very, very informative about understanding how to slow our own aging. So let's go back to the birds. This is a bird, this is a common swift, and what it does, its particular trick, is that it can fly for months and months and months without ever stopping and ever landing. These have flown over 9 months without ever landing. And here's a peregrine falcon. It can dive at 200 miles per hour, but I think almost just as remarkable is this bird here. This is an albatross, the Lysan albatross. This is an ornithologist named Charlie Robbins, great name for an ornithologist. And here he is banding a bird in 1956. And this bird was breeding, and they don't breed until they're at least 5. So the animal was at least 5 years old. Now, Charlie at that point was 38 years old when he banded that bird. Now, it looks big because they have these long wings and all these feathers. That bird actually weighs less than a small cat. It weighs about 6 pounds. So here's that same bird at the age of 72 last December when it came back to Midway Island. Now, Charlie, when he banded that bird, probably thought there's no chance that that bird is going to outlive me. And he lived to be 98. He had a good, long, active life. And he died in 2018. And here's Wisdom, the name of this albatross, still alive. So think of that. Something smaller than a small cat lived 72 years in all the challenges of nature. This is not living in a cage in your house where you feed it. It's had to survive storms. It's had to survive sea temperature changes, which changed the distribution of the prey. It survived this huge Fukushima tsunami, which killed 100,000 birds on Midway Island. So that's the kind of thing that birds can do. Now let's get back to the fire of life. I like that fire analogy. A famous physiologist, Hans Kleiber, did in fact call it the fire of life. Now there's this relationship. This is a graph of about 800 species of mammals and how long they live and how big they are along the bottom. And you can see there's a rough relationship that, generally speaking, the bigger a species is, the longer it lives. And we know this, dogs live longer than mice and horses live longer than dogs, that sort of thing. The other thing that not everybody knows about this is if we looked at their metabolic rate on a kind of per cell basis, it's declining the bigger they get. In fact, there was a theory early on in the aging literature called the rate of living theory that thought that you had a certain amount of energy that you could expend in a lifetime. And if you expended it fast, you lived a short amount of time. And if you expended it slowly, you lived a longer time. And that turned out not to be true in the details, but as a general pattern, it's really telling us something about the importance of metabolism. And so what metabolism does is it gives us a way to weigh physiological time. Physiological time is not the same as chronological time necessarily. Let me just tell you, take something as small as this hummingbird. It has fewer cells than we do, of course, but they turn over at a high rate. Its proteins turn over at a high rate. It develops quickly. Its reproductive rate, its heart rate is over 1,200 beats a second. It's a minute. It's like a machine gun, its heart is. It breathes fast. It eats fast, its food passes fast, its kidneys filter fast, everything is fast. And so it's living really at a very high rate. And I came up with a crude way to measure this. It's called the longevity quotient. And I just drawn a line, the line that fits all those points as well as possible. And the longevity quotient is very simple. Let's take an average animal defined of a certain size, where that line is. And let's say I want to know how long another animal lives relative to an average mammal of the same size. So all I do is take its real longevity, compare it to its expected longevity for an animal of the same size. And that's the longevity quotient. It's a very simple idea. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to come up with it. But I think it gives us a shorthand way of comparing animals of different sizes and how effective they are at overcoming all of the problems that metabolism itself presents us with. Now, let me just give you an idea of what the longevity quotient of various species is. So a house mouse lives about 70% as long as an average mammal at the size of a house mouse. A rat, laboratory rat, lives less than half as long as you would expect. That's why they're so popular in the lab, because you can do a lot of experiments in a hurry because they don't live very long and you can follow them throughout their life. Humans, you can see, we're already pretty successful. We live over 4 times as long as expected of another animal our size. For instance, an animal of our size might be a mountain lion. It's about the size of a human, but they only live into their 20s. They don't live to be 100 years old. So now let me just give you another crude way to think about physiological time. And that's at how fast the heart beats. This folk version of the rate of living theory went like this. We all have a fixed number of heartbeats. And if your heart beats fast, you'll use them all up and you'll die. So let's just look at some animals like the ones we've been talking about and look at how many heartbeats they have in a lifetime. So the giant tortoise, which lives 180 years, has about 600 million heartbeats in its lifetime because its heart beats very, very slowly. My wife, who's a veterinarian, once had a number of vet students, arguing whether an animal was alive or dead. A tortoise was alive, and they had an ECG hooked up to it at the time, and they still weren't exactly sure. A mouse, as you can see, has a few more heartbeats. The Greenland shark, for all of its nearly 400-year longevity, only has about 1 billion heartbeats in its life, which is less than 1/3 of what humans have. But a broad-tailed hummingbird with that very, very fast pace of life has more than twice as many heartbeats in its 12-year lifespan as humans do in a 100-year lifespan. So let me just summarize how birds compare with mammals, because I think birds are something that we could learn a great deal about. First of all, they're smaller than most of us on average. They have a faster metabolism, even at the same size. So if you took a bird in the same size mammal, the bird's metabolism, because to support the efforts of flying, is about twice as high. They have a faster metabolism for their size, and that means more oxygen radicals, everything else being equal. They have a higher body temperature. Birds have body temperatures 105, 106, 109 degrees. So higher than ours, it would be a fever. So that speeds up that browning reaction. They have levels of blood sugar that would be diabetic if it were in a human. Again, they need that high level of blood sugar to supply all the energy that they need to fly. But that again should accelerate browning. So we should have more oxygen radicals, faster browning, faster metabolism, and faster aging. No, birds live in the wild more than 3 times as long as mammals living in the nice, protected, safe environment of a zoo or a research laboratory. How do they do that? How do they overcome these destructive processes? I have to tell you that we don't know at this point because there's never been really a serious study of birds. So let me finally just make a suggestion here. It's a house mouse, the wild ancestor of our laboratory mouse. It lives 3 years under the best conditions in the lab. In the wild, they never live longer than a year. Life in the wild is very, very dangerous. You have freezes and thaws and floods and thunderstorms and predators. Here's a bird that's the same size. This is the most common bird in the world, the house sparrow. It lives up to 20 years in the wild, escaping all of those dangers that I just mentioned. What could we learn from that? I don't know, but I think we could learn a great deal. So I'd like to see a Manhattan Project. Let's figure out how the house sparrow does it. These are easy to keep in captivity. There's, like I say, they're the most common birds. So that's all I'm going to say about birds, but I want to move on to one other group. That arrow, so now I'm just plotting longevity quotient against the size. And so that red arrow points at humans. That's where we are. Like I say, we do better than most animals. Here's another particularly long-lived animal, the naked mole rat, you know, in all its charisma. I won't talk about that today. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on with naked mole rats, but I won't talk about that. What I'd like to talk about is this group here. These are the longest lived mammals for their body size with longevity quotients of 10. And that's, you can see how small that bat is. That's the bat that we're going to focus on. It's called Brandt's bat. So I want you to think about the challenges that bats have and how they overcome them. So first of all, bats have to maintain their ability to fly, obviously, and the agility to catch their insect prey, which are trying desperately to evade them. They have to maintain their high frequency hearing. They scream ultrasonically and they listen for the echoes. That's how they hunt. So a deaf bat is a dead bat. And not just doesn't have to just hear, it has to hear acutely well at the highest frequencies. Now, we lose our high frequency hearing in our teens. My daughters, when they were in high school, actually had ringers on their cell phones that they could hear and their teachers could not hear. That's because we all lose that high frequency hearing relatively early, but they do continue it. Bats have to be able to avoid predators. We're not the only ones who are smart enough to figure out that bats are going to boil out of this cave by the millions at sunset. So here's a red-tailed hawk that's in there trying to get them. So they have to be able to hunt. They have to be able to avoid predators, fly 50 to 100 miles a night. They have to maintain their hearing. They have to maintain their agility and endurance because they hawk animals out of the air, and they also have to avoid predators. They hibernate there for up to 9 months. What happens to us if we're in a bed in a hospital for a few weeks? We can hardly walk when we stand up. They sit there for 5 months, 9 months hibernated, and they wake up and they fly away. We have something to learn about muscle wasting from understanding them. They have an excellent spatial memory. They can fly 50 to 100 miles a night in the dark and find their way back to their roost. And if they left a baby in a roost with several other million bats in there, they've got to be able to find that baby. And they can do that for as much as 41 years. This is the oldest bat known, Brandt's bat, that lived 41 years after all that. So that's got an LQ of 10. Again, nobody thinks really about studying aging in bats, but they should. Actually, people now are doing that. And I think we're going to learn some great things. So let me finish up with leaving plenty of time for questions, with what I think is an intriguing comparison. And that's since you guys are a Marine Institute, I had talk about marine animals. That's in comparison the Greenland shark, which lives as long as 300 to 400 years, and the bowhead whale. And I'm showing their range distributions below because they both have one thing in common. They both stay year-round in very, very cold water, a lot of the time staying under the ice. The bowhead whale, in fact, that's how it gets away from killer whales and all, is it gets under the ice, which it can break through with its big head, but the killer whales can't, so they can't follow it under there. Now, you might think those would both be intriguing animals that we might be able to learn something about aging from. We're not going to keep them in the lab quite clearly, but it might be by working with their cells and transforming their cells into specific kinds of cells, we could learn something. But I'm going to tell you, I think we can learn a great deal from one of these species and relatively little from the other one. So let's look at the Greenland shark first. First of all, it lives 392 years is the estimate, and it's a guesstimate. The way they do that is that they looked at the eye lens, which is laid down when they're still inside the mama shark, and it stays there chemically inert the rest of their lives. And by doing radiocarbon dating on the eye lens, that's how they estimated this. It lives in very cold water. It has an extremely low metabolic rate. They figure that it can live a whole year if it catches one juvenile seal and eats it. Its heart rate, 5 beats per minute, and it very slowly moves. It moves about 3/4 of a meter per second. And to give you, and that's its top speed. It's actually cruising speed is about half that. To give you an idea about how slow that is, a healthy 80-year-old is faster than the top speed of a Greenland shark. So it lives a long time, but has very low lifetime biological activity. In fact, it doesn't even reach sexual maturity so that it can reproduce until it's about 150 years old. So I think if you want to live slow and live long, well, this is your guy. But if you want to live an active life and live long, you really want to look at the bowhead whale. So let's consider this. The first thing I want to, well, how do we know how old they are? And we do, it was done by a very clever trick, and that's amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. There's 20 different ones, and they're all born left-handed. So amino acids come in left-handed and right-handed versions, just like baseball pitchers. All living things produce left-handed ones, but over time, they spontaneously flip to right-handedness, and they do it at a rate that's well characterized. It's at a certain temperature, they flip at a certain rate. And different amino acids flip at different rates. So this ratio of left-handed to right-handed amino acids can be used to estimate the ages of things from the ages of humans. And they've actually validated that by taking teeth, not for this purpose, but teeth from dentists that got them from people of certain ages and doing the amino acid rationalization and being able to predict the age of the person that the tooth came from. But they've also used it for studying things that are up to 3 million years old, just by picking a different amino acid that does this at a slower rate. Well, they looked again at the eye lens because this is something that doesn't change over the course of a whale's life. And the racemization rate depends on the temperature. And they assumed that the bowhead whale had a normal mammalian body temperature. And when they did that, they estimated that of only 42 whales, because you can't legally kill these whales anymore, but some indigenous populations can, they estimated the age of the 3 oldest ones at up to 211 years. And this was validated to a certain extent because in some of these whales, they found these traditional stone arrowheads, harpoon heads, really, as they be. And looking at the collection of indigenous artifacts from the Smithsonian, figuring these had to have gotten into the whale when no later than the 1880s. So it's plausible. Now, I thought, well, if the whale is swimming in 2 to 4 degrees temperature, so like 36 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, its eye is just a few centimeters away from that water all the time. Does it really make sense to assume that that would be at the same temperature as the inside of the whale's body? Later on, they actually measured the inside of the whale's body, and it wasn't a normal mammalian temperature, it was colder. And so I recalculated the way they did this at the colder temperature, and I came up with a new estimate of at least 250 years. And I'm still assuming that the eye is at the same temperature as the inside of the body. If the eye is colder, because it's 5 centimeters from ice cold water, then this whale would be even colder. The other thing that makes them spectacular is that in cold water, a shark's metabolism slows because they don't make their own heat. Whales have to make more heat to compensate for the heat they lose to the cold water. So the whale metabolic rate has just been re-estimated, and it turns out it looks like it's 3 times higher than all the previous estimates. So we have a lot to learn. And the last thing I'll mention is just cancer resistance. I haven't mentioned this, but any large animal has to have cancer resistance to live a long time. And the logic is very simple. Every cell in your body has the potential to transform into a cancer ultimately. Well, whales have 1,000 times as many cells as we do, and we have about 30,000 times as many cells as a mouse. So you'd expect a mouse doesn't need much cancer protection, and in fact, it doesn't have much cancer protection. We have pretty good protection because when people get cancer, it tends to be decades after decades of life. But whales living into their 200s with all of these cells at risk must have some spectacular cancer resistance. We don't know much about this, but it would be worth it. So let me conclude here. I haven't included all of the interesting species because I didn't have the time, but I think that we have a lot to learn from long-lived, high metabolism, high body temperature species, which would include any number of bird species, some small, long-lived mammal species like naked mole rats that I didn't talk about, but especially about bats, and maybe even whales. So there are other species too, and I've given some here that I think we could learn quite a bit from. This picture of me, the one that Andrea showed at the beginning there, the clam on the that I'm holding in towards my right hand is over 500 years. It lives over 500 years. So that's a spectacular animal too. And then of course, the sea urchins, the tuatara, and the ol. So the ultimate goal of understanding this is not just to understand the neat tricks that evolution has up its sleeve, but discover how to keep people healthy longer. And I'll stop and I'll see if there are any questions. And while I'm taking questions, you can read some of the nice things people said about my book. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Steve, for a wonderful presentation. That was absolutely fascinating and really, really enjoyable. And we do have a few questions coming through. And actually, I'm going to start off with a question that was actually sent in ahead of time by one of our viewers. And this is a question about human aging. And the question is there anything you recommend doing now to increase our quality of life as we age?
Yeah, so there is a whole basket full of things that are on the verge of being available to help with human aging. But as of right now, today, I would say it's the boring stuff that your mother probably told you. Eat right, don't smoke, drink moderately, and particularly stay active. You know, one of the things we've learned in the last few years is that activity, and I prefer to say physical activity as opposed to exercise, because people think of exercise as, sweat pouring into your eyes and all that, but just simple physical activity is not only good for your heart and your lungs and your muscles, but we've now learned it's very good for your brain. It's very good for staving off dementia later in life. So today I'd like to say that there's some magic pill or potion. And many of my colleagues in the aging field might tell you that their particular company sells a pill or potion that's ready to make you live 200 years, but not yet, not yet. I need to wait till the evidence is in, but there's some very promising stuff that's just over the horizon.
That's great. Thanks. Is any of the things that are over the horizon, have any of those come from studying long-lived animals, or what?
Yes, some of them. Yeah, actually, there's some work on a chemical that's in the skin of the naked mole rat that looks like it might have wonderful anti-cancer properties as well as good properties for preserving the youthfulness of skin. So the cosmetic companies are very interested in it.
And a question from Chip Ziering in the audience. Yes, David Sinclair's lab has just published a study suggesting that epigenetic deterioration is a key factor in aging. Do you have any thoughts on this theory?
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that it is, because what happens epigenetically will affect what genes are turned on and off. And so again, this is a fairly new field, in that people were focused so long on the genetics and not the epigenetics. But the work that David just published and some other work is very exciting. We'll have to see how it plays out. You know, things are happening so fast in aging now that people tend, and also because population is aging, people are so desperate to hear good news that they'll leap at anything and assume that it's a huge breakthrough. We'll see about this reprogramming that David is doing. I think it's got a lot of potential, but again, we'll have to see how it plays out. I'm actually going to see him next week, and I'm going to ask him what they've done since then that they haven't published yet, because I'm curious.
That's great. Do all of these long-lived animals have unique mechanisms to promote longevity, or do you think there is a common anti-aging program that they all share?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I would say at this point, we probably know enough to know that there are many tricks, that there are many ways to age slowly and live long. There's not just one. The whales are probably doing it completely differently than the bats are doing it. We know, for instance, that even the cancer resistance of large animals, we have a pretty good idea of how elephants are as cancer resistant as they are. And we know enough about the whales to know that they don't do the same thing. So at least that suggests that there are many ways. And that's a good thing, because not all of these animal tricks will we be able to adapt to human use, but some of them, presumably, we will.
Great, thank you. A question from Joseph Siriani asks, how do the biological evolutionary niches that especially long-lived animals occupy shape their lifespans?
Yeah, that's a really good one. The general trend, the general tendency is that animals that live in ecological niches that confer safety live a long time. And the idea is that if you live in a relatively safe environment, it's safe either because it's inherently safe, or you have some qualities that make it safe, like the ability, say, to fly away from danger. The idea is that if that's the case, if you're not likely to be killed by a predator or a storm in the next few months, then evolution will favor developing an immune system that lasts a bit longer, or a heart that lasts a bit longer. And that because if they do that, then if your heart lasts longer and your immune system lasts longer, and you're not getting killed by predators, then you're likely to have more babies. And that's really what evolution cares about, is how many babies you leave, not how long you live, unless it affects the number of offspring that you ultimately leave behind.
Great, thank you. A question from Keith Wharton. What about telomere length in these species? How does that play a role in aging? So may want to just describe what telomeres are to start with.
Yeah, so telomeres are these repetitive strings of DNA that can be thousands of DNA letters long at the ends of chromosomes that protect the ends of the chromosomes from your cells thinking that it's broken DNA, which if your cell thinks it's got broken DNA in there, it's going to either commit suicide or it's going to stop dividing. Telomeres were very big in aging for a while, but these days, I think telomeres are still big news in the cancer field. I think less so in aging, because it turns out there's so much variability in telomere length. It's not hard to find a 70-year-old that has telomeres as long as a 20-year-old. They're not common, but it's not impossible. It's not like 1 in a million. And because of that variation, it's really hard to make clean predictions. Now, I have to say that when I say that, we're talking about a certain way of measuring telomeres, which is an average, of all the telomeres in your cells. It could be that there are specific ones that are very, very important. But the other thing, it used to be thought that the telomeres were the key to cell senescence, to cells losing their ability to divide. And we now know that that's true. They will lose their ability to divide if the telomeres get short enough. But we've also learned that there's a lot of other ways to turn off cell division. Any kind of serious cellular damage also turns off cell division. So today, if you go to AG meetings, you hear a lot less about telomeres than you did, say, 10 years ago. But I think if you go to cancer meetings, you still hear a great deal about them. And I think they're fascinating biology just from a pure biological perspective. We have such good tools for studying them these days.
That's great. Thank you. Now, you mentioned the Manhattan Project. I think it was with respect to the sparrow, but what kind of tools or resources are needed to really unlock the secrets of longevity of these understudied groups of animals?
So I think you need all the omics for a ways to start. We have a very good idea now of what processes are important in aging. You need to figure out how they do those processes, how they repair their DNA as well as they do. How do they avoid browning? You know, with the body temperature and the level of sugars they have, they should be browned like crazy. But if you actually look in a bird's blood and you look for brown proteins, you don't find many. So we need to know what their genes are producing and how their genes are protecting them against that. So what you need is a project with a lot of animals that you can subject to a lot of things that you can tease apart, not only their genome, but their transcriptome, their proteome, all the omics. And the thing is, we have the tools to do that now. It's just a question of basically the investment in it. We can do it very, very quickly. So I think that we could go from knowing virtually nothing about that to knowing a great deal in 5 years with a big Manhattan Project on it.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to ask a fish question. For animals like salmon that degenerate and die really quickly, what's the mechanism that causes that rapid decline? And is that accelerated aging?
It's not really the same as accelerated age. So we know pretty much in salmon what happens. It's actually hormonal. It's a gland. It overproduces thyroid hormone, basically leading to an immune system collapse, and they basically die of these opportunistic infections. There are mammals actually that do the same thing. There are these small marsupials, Antechinus, that is exactly the same thing. And it's not really same as accelerated aging because they all die of something very, very similar. And one thing about aging is it makes us different. If there's one thing you could say for sure about aging is it makes people different. For aging, all 25-year-olds are pretty much the same. All 80-year-olds are very, very different. Some are running marathons, some are in a wheelchair, some are still writing novels, and some are demented. And so that makes it very different than these sort of program steps where everything happens in a series of predetermined steps leading to death.
Okay, question from Stefan Abrano. Is there a correlation bats and their ability to carry the COVID virus as reported and their ability to fight off many viruses and longevity? Yeah,
bats do have a remarkable immune system, and they do carry vast loads of bats. I think there are 800 known coronaviruses that bats are carrying now, not counting the one that has been giving us all the trouble recently. So yeah, I think it's quite likely that there's something about that. And if you think about it, they invented cities long before we did. They've been living in these colonies of millions of individuals, really cheek by jowl, as you could see in that one photo I had. And they've been doing that for 30 million years, so, and that's the best way for infectious agents to be transmitted is in these big collections. So they have 30 million years to figure out how to deal with that. And they seem to have done a really, really good job. So I think the bat immune system could very well play a role in their exceptional longevity.
Thank you. From another question from Chip Ziering, who asks, evolution doesn't seem to care about longevity beyond reproductive capacity. Do the long-lived animals you study seem to continue reproducing much later in life?
Yes. Yes, they do. With a few exceptions, there are not many animals that we know that stop reproducing long before they die. There are some whales. There are, well, humans seem to be the only primate, but generally speaking, even 500-year-old clams are still reproducing. 200-year-old whales, so far as we know, are still reproducing. Although I don't know that I could say that with quite the authority, because killer whales, it turns out, do stop reproducing at about 50 years of age, just kind of like we do at 50 years of age. So, but that's unusual, and it's something that seems to be mainly confined to mammals. And maybe that has to do with the fact that we have a high level of parental care compared to other species.
That's great. Actually, we're running up against time here, so maybe just one question. This is a really high-level question, but love to hear your response to this. Is what's the biggest breakthrough in the field of aging research in recent years, or something that's coming up?
So that's a tough question, because I would say that there are 5 things that are extremely promising now. One of those I would say are the senolytics, the drugs that kill senescent cells. One of them I would say is the blood transfusion stuff, where young blood and old bodies rejuvenates them. There's the cellular partial reprogramming there. And which of these is really going to be the big breakthrough is going to be the one that really translates to humans, right? The most. I guess I would put those, and then there's a number of drugs like rapamycin that at least in mice have these remarkable properties of not just making them live longer, but protecting them against virtually everything that we can throw at them: cancer, Alzheimer's disease, blindness, muscle loss. So those are the things that I think are all potential breakthroughs, but it's going to be the one that breaks through the people that's going to be the first to cross the finish line.
That's great. Thank you so much, Steve, for spending the evening with GMGI tonight. Thank you for your time, for your insights, your amazing stories. It was really, really enjoyable evening. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Thank you so much to everybody in our audience for joining us this evening and for sending in your questions. And I apologize that I didn't get to all the questions this evening. So this is our final Science Hour episode of the winter season, but we look forward to bringing you new virtual content in October. To conclude tonight, I do want to mention that 2023 is a very special year for GMGI, in which we're celebrating our 10th anniversary. So we look forward to bringing you many events throughout the year to celebrate with us. And the first event is going to be a presentation by our very own Tim O'Donnell, our fisheries research scientist here at GMGI, and he is going to be speaking at Gloucester City Hall on March 22nd at 6 p.m. So stay tuned for more information and registration for that event. And in the meantime, please stay in touch with us. We love hearing from you. Thank you all for joining us, and good night, everyone.